Hi, this is Troy Hunt, and welcome to Ethical Hacking Social Engineering. Most of the time, when we all think about the security of information systems, we're talking about digital security. How do we protect our systems from attackers trying to exploit flaws in systems? In this course, I'm going to talk all about exploiting flaws in humans. So how are we as people vulnerable to being socially engineered such that an attacker gains an advantage in compromising the very systems that we were trying to protect with the digital controls? This course is really going to get you thinking about how we as humans are ultimately the weakest links in even the most secure systems. Let's move on and we'll take a look at the overview of what we're going to cover in this first module. We may not like to think it, but as humans, we are indeed the weakest link when it comes to securing systems. In this module, I'm going to start to talk about some of our human behaviors which leave us vulnerable to social engineering. There'll be behaviors that you're very familiar with, but you may not have thought about them in the past as weaknesses. Indeed, many of these attributes we look at as being desirable. But when it comes to exploiting humans via social engineering, they can be our own worst enemy. What you'll find as we progress through this first module is that humans are vulnerable to coercion. And when we're talking about social engineering and malicious attackers, we're talking about how can we get humans to circumvent otherwise very robust security controls. You're going to see many examples of that as we go through this first module and indeed the remainder of the course. But one other thing worth noting here as well is that social engineering certainly isn't new. In fact, we're going to start off with an example in just a moment about just how far back this style of attack actually goes. And not only is it not new, but it's something that you probably see yourself in the home every day. In fact, if you're a parent like me, you're probably a victim of it every day. And we're going to round out the module by looking at how kids exploit their parents using social engineering. Their behaviors which I suspect will be very familiar to many of you. So with that said, let's move on and start looking at the history of social engineering. The Trojan horse is a classic tale of subterfuge and social engineering. And this is a tale that dates all the way back to the Trojan War, many thousands of years ago, somewhere around 1188 BC by best estimates. As the tale goes, after a fruitless 10-year siege in which the Greeks were attacking the city of Troy, they ultimately constructed a wooden horse and filled it with a force of soldiers, after which the Greeks left the horse as an offering to the city. The Greeks then pretended to sail away, and the Trojans retrieved the horse, dragging it into the walled fortress as a symbol of their victory. But as night fell, the men emerged from the Trojan horse, and the Greeks sailed back under the cover of night and consequently conquered the city, decisively ending the war. It was a trick. The Greeks had fooled the Trojans into thinking that they were making a gesture of goodwill, a token of defeat, yet all the while having an ulterior motive and relying on the Trojans letting their guard down and being foolish enough to think that they had indeed won the war. This is a social engineering pattern that you're going to see multiple times throughout this course. The attacker, being the Greeks, fooling the victim, the Trojans, into believing the gesture they made, letting their guard down, becoming relaxed, feeling as though they were in control. And when their victim was at their most unprepared, the true intent behind the Greeks' gesture became clear, and the rest is now history. We'll see many similar examples of manipulating people into performing actions that they wouldn't otherwise have done had they used their better judgment, simply by clever social engineering. Let's move on and clearly define this and talk about why social engineering is the soft center within so many of our information systems. Let's start with a really clear definition. psychological manipulation. So think about the Trojan story I just told. The Greeks tricking the Trojans into believing they had the upper hand, and consequently causing people to perform actions or divulge confidential information that they wouldn't otherwise do. That's really the heart of it. That's the objective. The social engineering aspect is just the road to get there. Now, we often talk about people being the soft center of systems. Let me show you what I mean by that. Have a think about the security controls within the systems you use, and indeed the systems that many of you build. So for example, we have security controls such as firewalls. We have firewalls in server environments, firewalls on desktops, dedicated firewall devices. We spend huge amounts of money on firewalls. And they're a very good product too, a very necessary product. And they form part of the hard shell around many of the information systems that we use. An attacker has to penetrate the firewall in order to gain access to the systems within. Another hard shell around our information systems is access controls. We want to have very robust authorization rules around who can access what. This is digital security. Unless you're an authorized identity, you simply can't get access to the resources you're requesting. And again, also great, we need robust, strong access controls, and we implement them at the system level. Another example again is antivirus. This is a crucial part of protecting systems. Antivirus tools understand what typical malicious software patterns look like. The ability to identify malicious software before it's able to damage systems or disclose information is obviously really important. Antivirus forms an important part of the information security of both home and corporate environments. In fact, all three of these things are staples of digital security. These are the default security controls on so many of the systems that we use and build. But here's the thing about social engineering. Behind these controls, within the hard shell that they provide us, are the vulnerable humans. The people who sit within the firewall, who have access to the files which we would otherwise protect with access controls, and who have the ability to run software on those environments, potentially circumventing antivirus controls. People have a huge amount of power well and truly after all those hard shell protections have been applied. And that's what we're really going to look at during this course. How can the vulnerable humans be exploited to circumvent the hard security controls that you see above here? It's this paradox that has led social engineering to often be described as the soft center within the hard shell. And in fact, you'll sometimes see it being referred to as the M&M problem. The crunchy hard outer that protects that soft chocolate inside. And that's really the social engineering example again. Those hard outer security controls, but us weak, vulnerable humans inside. And what it means is we get left with situations like this. This is a quote from Kevin Mitnick, probably the most infamous computer hacker of all time. Kevin became particularly notorious in the early 90s, breaking into numerous systems and frequently doing so using social engineering. As Kevin says here, even very well protected companies protected with good digital security, can be brought undone just by one trusted person within the company. That's all it takes. One vulnerable person in the soft center who can be socially engineered by an attacker and render all that good money spent on digital security absolutely useless. This is precisely what we're going to look at throughout the remainder of this course. How can humans be engineered in order to circumvent those otherwise very good security controls? Let's move on now and start taking a look at some of the human weaknesses that make all of this possible. How can an attacker convince people to do something that they would not otherwise do? One of the most commonly exploited human weaknesses in social engineering is greed. offer people something that they want. Let me give you a perfect example. You have almost certainly received emails like this, and certainly one of the most common exposures that you have to social engineering is via phishing emails. In this case, the attacker is preying on the greed of the victim, and this is why we see an offer of $4.5 million. There are tens of thousands of variations of this very same email. Hey, I've got a heap of money. I'd like to try and give you some. I just need a little bit of information from you. And of course, the information being requested down here will then lead into further questions and ultimately the attacker socially engineering personally identifiable data out of the victim. Many times these emails also lead to the attacker socially engineering money directly out of the victim, both of which are obviously quite attractive to the social engineer. So greed is a human weakness that makes us all vulnerable. Another weakness is fear. If we can frighten the victim into acting in a way that they wouldn't normally do, that can give the social engineer an upside. Here's a good example of that. This is an extortion email that followed after the Patreon data breach in 2015. Here the attacker is relying entirely on the fear of the victim. And they're doing that by saying that they have sensitive personal information about the victim. And if money is not paid, they're going to leak that information online, which would damage their credit score. If a victim is fearful enough about that happening, they may act irrationally and actually pay the ransom. Now, in this case, the data leaked out of the Patreon system was actually very well encrypted. It's highly unlikely that the attacker could actually do anything with it, but that doesn't matter. All that matters is that the attacker can scare the victim enough that they're convinced they need to pay the ransom. There's also another weakness being preyed on down towards the bottom, and it's this one here about the time limit. There is urgency implied in this email. Act within 48 hours or your data is going to be leaked. Which brings me to the next human weakness. Urgency. When people feel that they're under pressure to perform an action within a given period of time, they'll act irrationally. This is how many of the infomercials that you see on TV work. Act now in order to get your discount. Offer valid only for the next 20 callers or the next 2 hours or whatever the social engineer can use to convince the target that there's urgency. And make no mistake, a lot of marketing is social engineering as well. But let me give you an example within information security of urgency as a weapon of the social engineer. Also in 2015, we saw this story about how John Brennan, the director of the CIA, had his personal email hacked. Now in this case, the attacker was socially engineering Verizon, his telecoms provider, and the social engineer pretended to be an employee of Verizon. And he called up the company and said, hey, my tools are down. I'm trying to fix something urgently, but I can't get access. Can you just give me a little bit of information about the director of the CIA, and then I'll be able to fix the problem. So the attacker implied urgency in order to get the Verizon worker to behave in a way that was almost certainly against their better judgment. Another human weakness we often see exploited in social engineering attacks is curiosity. The saying goes that curiosity killed the cat, and it's that same behavior that gets humans into trouble when they're being socially engineered. For example, this Facebook post. I wrote about this back in 2012, and it's a classic clickjacking scam. I saw this appear on my timeline because a friend of mine had liked the link. It was out of character for them, so I did some further investigation. And what's happening here is we've got a story that makes people curious. We often see this style of bait headlines or bait advertising. And you'll see things like, you wouldn't believe what happened next, or try this one unique trick, something that makes people curious enough to click through. In this particular case, once you clicked through and tried to play the video to see what the girl was actually doing, it used a clickjacking vulnerability within Facebook to cause you to like the post. And of course, once you like a post on Facebook, your friends see that you like the post. And then they take a look at it, and then their friends see that they liked the post. And the whole thing propagates. Even my mother-in-law fell for this one. And I don't think it's that she was genuinely interested in the content of the story, but she was curious. And curiosity will get people to do all sorts of things that they wouldn't normally do. Another human weakness is sympathy. Now, we might not often think of sympathy as being a weakness, but it is a behavior that can be exploited via a social engineer. Let me give you an example. This is one variation of a scam that's been going for a very long time now. Sometimes this is referred to as the grandma or the imposter scam, and it tells stories of misfortune in order to get the recipient of the email to feel sympathetic to the sender. We were mugged at the park of the hotel where we stayed. And then, of course, they just need a little bit of money to help them get back on their feet. And then they'll send that money back to the victim. Allegedly. Of course, that doesn't actually happen. We've seen variations of this scam either sent as random spam or sent to everyone in the address book of a compromised email account. So if you saw this coming from someone you know and you thought they were in trouble, you would feel sympathetic. Would that sympathy possibly cause you to follow the instructions precisely here and send them money? Quite possibly. Certainly this has been successful enough that it has actually continued to run for a long time. So sympathy, as much as we often think of it as a positive attribute, can be used for evil. Respect for authority is one that you're going to see a lot throughout the remainder of this course, primarily because when someone believes somebody else is in a position of authority, particularly a position that commands a degree of respect, the victim is likely to behave in ways they wouldn't normally do. For example, if the victim believes that they're talking to their boss, or even perhaps the CEO of the company, they're going to behave in a way that they wouldn't normally do with someone they didn't have the same level of respect for. Let me give you an example of respect for authority. This is a scam allegedly run by the Australian Federal Police, and it's a speeding fine scam. This is not legitimate. The AFP doesn't send traffic infringement notices via email in this fashion. And in fact, if you did click through to this, your machine may have been infected with ransomware. So definitely not the outcome that victims were expecting. An attack like this is successful because if someone can be convinced that they're talking to the police, they're going to show a level of respect that they wouldn't otherwise have shown. Now in this case, it's not only the authority figures sending the message, but they're also applying urgency, which is what we just saw before. So often these attacks will use multiple behaviors or exploit multiple weaknesses in people in order to achieve the social engineer's objective. Helpfulness is another one of these behaviors that we probably don't normally think of as a weakness. It's a positive attribute. You would like people to be helpful. But that can also be a weakness. If the social engineer can leverage the helpful nature of an individual to their advantage, they can often obtain information that they never would have otherwise been able to get their hands on. Let me give you a perfect example of this. In 2013, the whistleblower Edward Snowden exfiltrated a huge number of confidential documents from the NSA. Part of what made this attack successful was that he was able to socially engineer his co-workers into providing their credentials. Allegedly, he persuaded between 20 and 25 co-workers to give him their usernames and passwords by convincing them he needed them to do his job as a computer systems administrator. This is simply preying on the helpful nature of his colleagues. Their intentions were no doubt good. They wanted to help their fellow worker achieve his job. But of course, as we now know, Snowden used that information to access a huge amount of data that he should never have had access to. He successfully socially engineered those colleagues by exploiting their human weakness, which was helpfulness. So that's a bunch of weaknesses that we all have that have been used in various ways to mount social engineering attacks. As we progress through the remainder of this course, I'm going to often refer back to these weaknesses, and we'll look at precisely what it was about the victim that the attacker exploited in order to make their social engineering attack successful. Let's now move on and have a look at a couple of different types of social engineering attack. You'll often see social engineering broken down into two categories: computer-based and human-based. Let me give you some examples of each. A phishing email, for example, is a computer-based attack. The email is sent electronically, someone reads it in their email program, and interacts with the attacker entirely over the internet. This is not the attacker physically interacting with the victim or even talking to the victim. It's all done via the computer. Same again for malicious software updates. So this is the sort of thing you'll see from an infected website, where you browse to the website and it will say, hey, your antivirus or your Windows operating system or something else about the machine that you're using is out of date. Just download this one piece of software and we'll update it for you. That's computer-based. It's something that the victim sees there on the screen in front of them. Same again with viral hoaxes. So for example, we just saw the Facebook one with the title that said, "She did that in public high school every day." That goes viral. People get very curious about it, they click on the link, and now they're propagating the hoax. But like the other two, it is also computer-based social engineering. And again, all that the victim is doing is interacting with their machine. Now let's move on to human-based social engineering. And a good example of this is impersonation. We saw that in the director of CIA example before, where the attacker has actually called up Verizon and they're talking to the victim, and in this case, Verizon was the victim of the social engineering scam, and the attacker is talking to them. There's a conversation, there's a backwards and forwards. It's a very different style of attack to something appearing in email and being sent electronically. Shoulder surfing is another good example. So this is where the quote-unquote attacker is looking over the shoulder of the victim. So they might be observing the password that the victim is typing into their machine. This is social. They are still there face-to-face or face-to-back, as it may be. But the point is, it's something that happens in person. Same again with tailgating. So this is the process of the attacker following the victim through an otherwise secure door. So picture an environment with swipe cards or turnstiles, where you have to identify yourself before moving through the gateway. If an attacker can simply latch on to the back of someone else, metaphorically, mind you, they just follow the individual through, then they may gain access to a physical environment they shouldn't have access to. And again, it is all in person. It's a human-based social engineering attack. So as we proceed through the course, you're going to see many examples of both. Purely computer-based social engineering, where the attacker is simply communicating digitally, and human-based engineering, where the attacker actually has to get engaged with the victims. So remember this definition as we move through the course. Let's now go and look at one more thing before we wrap up the module, and that's social engineering at home and in popular culture. We all get exposed to some degree of social engineering every day. I mentioned infomercials before. Every time you see an advertisement, there is a degree of social engineering, psychological manipulation to get you to do something that you may not otherwise have done. If you're a parent, you almost certainly see this every day. I certainly see it from my kids, and they've become very adept at knowing when to look sad or despondent, how to appeal to my sympathies, what my weaknesses as a parent are, what might be the things that they could get me to do in order to give them an advantage. Crying is a perfect one. Can I make Daddy feel sorry for me? Will he possibly cave in and buy me that toy or let me watch that TV show? They may not be overly sophisticated social engineers, but kids sure do get a lot of practice at it. Another place you'll regularly see social engineering is in the movies. So for example, in the 2003 version of The Italian Job with Mark Wahlberg, there's a great social engineering scene where they want to gain access to a victim's house, so they disconnect his cable TV. He calls up and books a repairman who can't arrive for a couple of days, so the social engineer calls back and says, "Hey, we've got a spot available today. Would you be happy to let them into your house?" The cable repair person then turns up, and all the victim can do to verify the identity of that person is look at a forged badge. That's all. Now they have access. But if you're really interested in social engineering in popular culture, this movie personifies it. Catch Me If You Can. This is the 2002 screen adaptation of the true story of Frank Abagnale Jr. This is really worthwhile watching because it's full of social engineering examples, courtesy of Leonardo DiCaprio, who plays the lead character. In the movie, his character is a con man who builds trust and confidence with his victims by being charming before having them perform an action they really shouldn't do. So for example, he poses as a pilot because pilots have an air of authority and credibility about them above and beyond someone in, say, just a normal suit. Victims are distracted by the authority and his charming nature that he's able to engage with them and ask them questions about things like how are checks created and processed. And he's often speaking to young women in banks who get distracted by that charm and disclose information which they shouldn't otherwise do. When you watch the movie, you'll see that as a social engineer, he's always confident and assertive. Even when he's being grilled by the FBI, his convictions are firm. He knows exactly what he's doing. And that confidence becomes part of the charade. Even the FBI get fooled by him. So if you want a great example of what social engineering looks like and how some of the weaknesses that we saw earlier on are exploited, go and check out Catch Me If You Can. In the next module, we'll also go through a real live social engineering attack that someone attempted to mount against me. We're going to break that down and analyze exactly the techniques that the scammer in that case tried to use. That's all for the introductory module though. Let's go and look at the summary. Let's summarize the module. And one thing that should be very clear now is that as humans, we're all vulnerable to this. As much as we would like to think we're not, we all have weaknesses that can be exploited via an adept social engineer. Part of the problem of this is because many of our virtues can be turned back against us. We want to be helpful. We want to trust people. Being sympathetic to our fellow man is a good thing. But all of these otherwise positive human attributes can work against us. We'll see many more examples of this as we work through the course. And finally, as I said a number of times, we see social engineering every single day, via our kids, via advertising, in social media, and certainly via our junk mail folders. That's a lot of computer-based social engineering that comes in through spam. But of course, we do see this human-based social engineering every day as well. This is a major threat, and it's extremely effective at circumventing that hard shell of security controls that we typically think of as defenses against attackers. So that's the intro now wrapped up. Let's move on to the next module and take a look at a real live social engineering attack. We're going to dissect this and look at exactly what tricks the social engineer is using to try and convince me that my computer is infected with viruses and that I need to pay them money.